We want to get reaction from someone who's personally endured the crisis in Syria. Nidal Bitari is a Syrian refugee now living here in the United States. So the Security Council coming together, they've been so enormously divided on this issue. Do you see it as a good sign?
Thank you, Mike, first. And actually, yeah, it seems like it's a good step that it indicates that there is an achievement had been achieved between Russia and the United States, that we didn't see a veto on this adoption. So yeah, I think it's a good sign that we might see something progress and the peace in Syria in the next year. But I'm carefully optimistic about this because of the complicated situation on the ground in Syria, and actually specifically about identifying who will be involved in this process, especially the armed groups. Yeah.
Well, there's so many. I mean, you personally know this, but I mean, there's so many groups with arms there. Who sits down at the table? Who negotiates this? I'm sure that a lot of people clearly not happy if ISIS is a part of that, and they would not be. But you know what I'm saying. You've got a lot of different factions there. How do you determine who sits down at the table?
Actually, I'm afraid that most of these groups will not be talking on behalf of themselves. They will be talking on behalf other forces from outside our countries, like Gulf states and other countries. These countries did not involve directly in the war in Syria, but you know they funded and armed many groups inside Syria, and these groups do not have their own strategy. They are working on the strategy of these countries. And on the other side, you know, there is a direct intervention in Syria occurred by the Iranians and by Hezbollah from Lebanon and from Shia militias from Iraq, and recently from Russia.
Right, of course. Yeah. It's gotten more and more complicated, more and more players. You left in January of 2012. You were able to get out, and undoubtedly it was very difficult then. What do you think about the people who remain, who have to deal with this? And you can target places, but when bombs come cascading down, they don't necessarily always hit the intended targets. I mean, innocent people are killed as well.
Yeah, actually, the civilians who are paying the highest price in this war in Syria. Actually, maybe a lot on news. Syria is a lot on the news, but a lot of people do not know that all the Syrian population is about 23 million people. Half of them now either are internally displaced or refugees around the world, and 8 million of them live only in Damascus. So can you imagine how empty these areas are? A lot of areas in Syria are really empty, and the areas where that really targeted are where these people are remained, like what happened yesterday when Russia hit in Douma.
Let me ask one final quick question. What people probably don't recognize is that you're not just a refugee from Syria. You're a Palestinian refugee.
Exactly.
Before that, if anyone knows the refugee story, it's you. As you look at the landscape when it comes to refugees, what needs to be done in the short term and long term?
Actually, a lot of talks now is happening about the resettlement, but resettlement is only it's particularly for 1% of refugees around the world. I mean, 1% of refugees around the world are being resettled every year. But what about the others? I mean, in the Syrian crisis, the refugee crisis is it's not the crisis itself. The crisis was in the management of this crisis. What should happen is to manage this crisis especially after February, because 2016, because the United Nations, the Security Council today issued that in February there will be a meeting in London discussing the refugee crisis in Syria. Other than that, if they could not manage this crisis, we'll see that in the next year more and more people fleeing from Syria.
I'm sorry to say we've run out of time, but not optimistic, clearly. But thanks so much for coming in and giving me
Thank you
your
so much.
assessment.